Calling all lovers of mystery and fans of a good story. If you haven't already heard me talk about June's Journey, you're in for a treat. It's time to don your detective hat in this free hidden object mobile game that delves into the captivating journey of June Parker, a self-proclaimed detective on a quest to unravel the mystery surrounding her sister's untimely death. In June's Journey, you get to play as June, deciphering clues and unveiling secret plots within thousands of beautifully illustrated scenes. And did I mention it's set in the glitzy 1920s? New chapters are added weekly, so you will never run out of new thrills to uncover, and you can also personalize and decorate your very own Orchid Island where the story takes place. How sharp are your detective skills? Find out when you download June's Journey on your Android or iOS device, or play online via Facebook Games. Your detective journey awaits.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Burntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I uncover the blasphemous truth of a plague-ridden world, that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Burntwine, coming January 2nd, wherever podcasts are available.
Hi, I'm Perry Carpenter, one of the hosts of the Digital Folklore podcast, and this is Digital Folklore Unplugged. Unplugged episodes are where we ditch all the fancy production and storytelling elements and bring you the raw, or only slightly edited, interviews with our folklore experts. On today's episode, my co-host Mason and I got to speak with Andrew Peck.
I'm Dr. Andrew Peck. I'm an assistant professor of strategic communication at Miami University, also known as Miami of Ohio, also known as not the fun Miami.
Now, this was a very, very special interview for us because it ties all the way back to the ending lines of Season 1, Episode 1. If it's been a while since you've listened to that episode, you may have forgotten that we ended with a quote from Andrew's paper, Tall, Dark, and Loathsome, the Emergence of a Legend Cycle in the Digital Age. And that was the perfect way to move into the rest of the season. After that episode, Andrew was kind enough to reach out to us with some very encouraging words. And that validation, right after our first episode, was incredibly encouraging and much needed. It was an honor to be able to bring Andrew onto the show in Episode 7 of Season 2. He blew us away with his acting and how all in he was in the role that we wrote for him. And so, if you haven't yet listened to that episode, you definitely want to add it to your list. I'll put a link in the show notes for you. Okay, and now, let's get to the unplugged version of our interview with Dr. Andrew Peck.
So you hate the Mandela effect?
Hate it. I think it's an excuse for people to not admit that they just have shitty memories. We have this idea that our memory is infallible. And I think a lot of that kind of comes from the technologies that we're raised around, right? That when you have something like a printed word in a book, you can go back and reference it, and it's going to be the same each time you look at it. When you have things like photographs, you can pick those up, you can look at them, they're going to be the same each time you look at it. And so we sort of developed this idea in our heads where our memory works like a photograph. It works like printed words in a book. And I cannot stress enough how memory is as a faculty. So instead of just admitting that maybe we kind of make a lot of best guesses, we instead decide that we're going to create these elaborate fictional universes where it was always the Berenstain Bears. Because as a 5-year-old, I definitely saw that and not Berenstain Bears.
Then that really is the crux of it, isn't it? It seems to revolve around a lot of cultural touchstones in media that we're misremembering. But it gets reinforced so strongly.
Yeah. That we find other people online who have kind of similar memories. And instead of just admitting that we were all wrong, haha, isn't this funny? Instead, we create this sort of elaborate belief concept where there might be divergent realities, and some people have memories of reality A and other people have memories of reality B. And isn't it this cool, elaborate thing? So we don't have to admit that they're wrong, right? And one of the reasons I hate it is I really think one of the biggest issues that we're running into in American culture is this stress that being wrong is the worst thing you can be. And the Mandela effect is just a distillation of that. It's this distillation of this really kind of toxic issue that instead of dealing with, we're going through huge mental gymnastics to avoid.
So when it comes to folklore, though, are there other branches of folklore that start to talk about the weirdness of memory that maybe aren't tied to Mandela effect?
So yes, but here's the tricky caveat here. There is folklore that talks about things like oral tradition and memory. It's not necessarily what I'm conversant in. Most of what I know tends to be more from my research in communication or some stuff in like sociology and psychology. So as far as how much I can talk to that, I might not be the person to ask.
But in terms of the ways that things like this are transmitted and the ways we can reinforce it and convince each other that we're right and we're all misremembering it, there is like that element of, just like in the Slenderman legend, of everyone is adding little pieces to this story and then the group is yes-anding it. The transmission of it's very folkloric, right?
Most certainly. So you have this sort of thing where someone comes up with this idea. I believe the Mandela effect was originally named because some people believe that Nelson Mandela, the politician, died in the 1980s, and other people are like, no, he's been alive the whole time, which is true. But instead of dealing with the fact that some people were shitty at remembering news stories, instead, we created reality A and reality B. And then we have other examples, right? The Berenstain Bears is the one I always hear, Berenstain versus Berenstein. What are some other examples of Mandela effect?
Well, the one that I was shook by, just because I felt very strongly that I remembered it, but I acknowledge that it's not true, is the cornucopia and the Fruit of the Loom logo. It's not there.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I had this memory about being in school and learning what a cornucopia was because they brought that logo up. However, that cannot have been true, and it must have been something else because there's no cornucopia. You imagine like the cornucopia with the fruit in front of it, but it's just the fruit, and it's always just been the fruit.
It's just the fruit, yeah. And I guess like maybe there are a few events where we just see like fruit together that's not in a bowl or coming out of a horn. So we just kind of fill that thing in with like a best guess, a sort of a mental schematic, a sort of a, I'm losing the word here, but there's a word for it.
Like a mental heuristic.
That's what I'm trying to think of.
Yeah, like a System 1 Daniel Kahneman type of shortcut.
This is how the thing usually works, so I will fill this thing. If A, then B. If group of fruit, then thing to hold the fruit.
I want to find an avenue about that mechanism, because it's similar to how disinformation spreads. I mean, it's similar to how a lot of things spread.
Oh, yeah. So we've been talking about if there is fruit, there must be something to hold the fruit. We do really similar mental things with headlines when it comes to news stories, that the vast majority of people don't actually read the news story before forming an opinion. They read the headline, they make an assumption based on their own heuristic about what the story is about, and then have a response based on that assumption. It's one of the reasons fake news is so hard to stop, because even when you're fact checking, it doesn't really matter if no one's actually opening your story, or a minority of people are opening the story. And even then, a minority of the minority get past the lead in the nut graph. So yeah, we have all these kind of assumptions based on our own internal attitudes, our own internal beliefs that really inhibit the circulation of truth, fact checking, of challenging our own beliefs. We sort of internally want to insulate ourselves from those sort of challenges. And that's a problem because being challenged is how we grow as people. And the internet makes it really easy to avoid being challenged.
Which is interesting, right? Because the idea, like the prevailing opinion, was that the internet would create this connected world where we're all growing and learning from each other and exposed to these things. And yet that has not panned out exactly. It has in some ways, but not others.
The early promise of the internet that now everyone finally gets a voice. We can avoid the mass media gatekeepers and it brings power to the people. And we kind of forgot that a lot of people kind of suck.
Yeah.
What the internet does, not even the internet, what a lot of the social media sites that we use, it's the most popular use of the web on like an hour by hour basis per person is social media. It passed email back in like 2012, I think, is the most time we spend online is social media. And what social media does is it uses algorithms that present content to you and filter out other forms of content. And it gives you stuff that it thinks you're going to want to see. It gives you mental candy, just scoop after scoop after scoop. And it edits out stuff that it thinks you don't want to see. stuff that might challenge you, stuff that might diverge from what you think. It takes away all that stumble upon potential that was so imbricated in that promise of the early internet, that you're going to see all these different kind of viewpoints. We're going to get this pluralistic idea of what everyone thinks. Well, now social media algorithms, in order to keep you on the site and keep you interacting, are just giving you things that are going to give you an emotional response, that are going to get you sharing them out of anger, or going to get you sharing them because, yeah, I agree with this.
So when you say the things that you want to see, it may not just be things that you want to see because you agree with it, or it's things that you want to see because you're going to have an emotional response to and potentially share in some way.
Yes. And this is important. It's not just everything that you're seeing is stuff that agrees with you. There are places on the internet that organize themselves really well for that kind of thing. Reddit would be a really good example where you can sign up for something that's kind of topically bounded. But if we're thinking about something that's a little more kind of open, your Facebooks or your Instagrams, your Twitter, it's not necessarily going to be stuff that you agree with, but it's going to be stuff that evokes an emotional response, because that tends to be the stuff that provokes engagement. So you might see, for instance, things that are effectively rumors or hoaxes, but maybe you really want to believe that they're true, or maybe you're like, oh, I can't believe this media company would do this thing. And that gets you forwarding them to more people, which gets the rumor spreading. And a really sort of troublesome bit in all of this is the ways in which a lot of news producers, whether we're thinking about like online tabloids or even, some bulwarks of reputable journalism, New York Times, Washington Post, will often start picking up digital rumors and reporting on the rumors as rumors, but the way in which we read those stories gives them a certain veracity. It reinforces the rumor. Once we start hearing something again and again and again, it overcomes our bullshit filter and it starts becoming fact.
Something that's interesting that this makes me think of is the power of folk belief, and like the power of someone that telling you something, even if they have no knowledge at all. Like trusting each other in our groups and distrusting experts is such an interesting phenomenon to me.
It's this constant deferral of fact-checking, where I assume that since my friend has posted this, they must have fact-checked it, otherwise they wouldn't have posted it. Or that since this comes from this organization, they must have fact-checked it and aren't just reporting on a rumor or a social media trend, which is really easy to game. And so there's this constant deferral of fact-checking. I talk about this in my recent book when it comes to the moral panic around the Slender Man, that when you think about how this actually happened, it's the two young women said this to their police interviewers. Police interviewers didn't know what this was, so they put it just without critique in the criminal complaint. Then the news media gets a hold of the criminal complaint after the press conference announcing it, and they see it and they don't know what it is, so they reproduce it. And then you see online tabloids saying, oh, well, all of these news organizations like the AP are reporting on what we know as this internet character being responsible for this crime. We're going to make that the story. And then you get people on social media seeing this and being like, oh, that can't possibly be true. And so they start forwarding it and talking about it on Twitter, often kind of incredulously. And then we get mainstream publications seeing that there's a trend on social media, and then they start reporting on it as if it is a thing. And all the way down, we have people deferring fact-checking of what is this thing? Is this actually accurate? Beyond just something a little girl said to, the next level below them. So we have this story that becomes a national news item that has no actual core. It's just layer upon layer of rumor building on each other as stuff ends up trending on social media, and as journalists cover social media as if it's fact.
And what's interesting is that is institutions doing this, right? These are centralized things.
Mm-hmm. And can you believe that then people have trouble trusting institutions? There's this effect. I think it's called the Gell-Mann effect. It was made up by Michael Crichton. Basically, it's the idea that when you read a news story you actually have like personal experience or expertise in, you're like, oh, this thing's riddled with errors, it's misconstrued. And then you read the next story down, you're like, oh, yes, I do believe this thing. In other words, we tend to give the benefit of the doubt unless we know otherwise. And this is to our friends. This is to institutions on social media. This is in many ways how we're taught as people who exist in a print culture, a society that places a lot of emphasis on the written word, stuff that's written down. We are conditioned from a very young age to give that more credence than we might give, say, like an orally shared rumor, right? Gossip is oral, but things that are written, they have a little more gravity to them. And because of that, a lot of stuff on the internet, which travels via this sort of written modality, can often circumvent our greater capacity for scrutiny.
That's really interesting because all of that was much more prominently institutional than people communicating in that manner. I mean, you have letters and stuff, obviously, but
think about letters, for example. Does anyone teach you how to write a letter to your grandma?
I think we did it in third grade, but they didn't teach us how to.
We had one day when we were 9, right after we read the Berenstain Bears.
Right.
So here's the thing. We can think about written communication and oral communication along sort of 2 lines. There's formal or institutional, and then there's informal or non-institutional or vernacular. So we're taught formal writing. This is almost all that school is. And we might get a day on informal writing, on practicing writing a diary entry or sending a letter to grandma, but we don't really get a lot of instruction in informal writing. And so you see these really big variations in informal writing styles between different groups, especially cross-generational groups. For instance, my parents, when they text, love just using all kinds of emojis for any reason. And to me, that's weird. And that's because the way in which they were trained to write informally was sort of punctuated by, doing kind of little drawings to capture a mood to make up for facial cues that weren't there. When they were, say, sending a postcard, wish you were here, heart, so-and-so. And so to them, informal writing has these little flourishes that they often make up for in texting by overusing emojis. They're also tend to be very literal when it comes to emoji use. So that when I reply to something my mother texts me with the skull emoji, this is so funny, I am dying, to her, she thinks I am in trouble.
Right.
Aww.
So there are ways in which writing is taught to us all through school, all through college, all through life as this sort of formal thing. Even email tends to, unless proven otherwise, mimic sort of formal forms of writing. Right.
And that's really interesting when looking at a sort of generational difference in the way in which we communicate through writing, in that a lot of people who are younger now who grew up in the presence of the internet have an entirely different set of context and subtext for things like emoji and use of punctuation. If you end a sentence with a period, you're being a little firm, but parents don't understand that.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
My wife has someone she works with who ends every statement with a period. And apparently it is extremely off-putting.
And yet it's just proper grammar.
Yeah. Dear so-and-so, I hope you are well.
My kids have turned off all the autocorrect and auto punctuation on their text messages. And so now I just get streams of stuff with everything in lowercase and no punctuation. And it's unnerving to me.
Also, apparently using voice to text function is real Gen X, boomer, older millennial stuff. And it does not come off well to the Gen Zers.
It's interesting that shift. And I hadn't thought about how we are conditioned only for formal writing, and then that plays into the trust, and even when it's just people writing to each other.
More of our interview with Dr. Andrew Peck after this. Hey listeners, if you're like me and enjoy escaping to a real movie theater, then Regal Unlimited just makes sense. It's the all-you-can-watch movie subscription pass that pays for itself in just 2 visits. You can see any standard 2D movie anytime with no blackout dates or restrictions. And your membership lets you get into premium format shows like IMAX and 4DX at a reduced cost. Plus, you'll save 10% on all non-alcoholic concessions. Regal Unlimited. It's the all-you-can-watch movie subscription pass that pays for itself in just 2 visits. So, if you're planning on seeing a couple movies this month, join Regal Unlimited. Now is the best time as summer's coming up. Sign up now in the Regal app or on the website at regmovies.com/unlimited. And be sure to use the code Folklore24 to get 10% off a 3-month subscription.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But we also sell merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell and grow at every stage of your business, from the launch your online shop stage all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. They have an all-in-one e-commerce platform and in-person POS system, so wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. With the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms, Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers. Shopify has allowed us to share something tangible with the podcast community we've built here, selling our beanies, sweatshirts, and mugs to fans of our shows without taking up too much time from all the other work we do to bring you even more great content. And it's not just us. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Shopify is also the global force behind Allbirds, Rothy's, and Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Because businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/REALM now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/realm.
Welcome back.
There's two things I want to hit on. One is I'd never heard of the Gell-Mann effect, and so I Googled it real quick. And Gell-Mann amnesia being like you read an article that you know something about, and you see it wrong, and you laugh about it, and then you just turn the page and are reading the next thing and assuming it's more accurate somehow.
Yeah.
Is that basically it?
That is exactly what I was trying to get at. That when you have firsthand knowledge, you're like, oh, yeah, no. But then you immediately give credence as soon as you turn the page or you look at the next column, like, oh, yeah, no, this must be accurate.
Which is, I never thought about that, and it's so true.
Yeah, and also it's an example of itself because you hear like Gell-Mann effect, like that sounds, like important, but then you actually like read up on it and it's basically just something Michael Crichton made up and gave a fancy name. So we'd give it credence and believe it's true when someone's actually researched this and, done stuff. And no, it's just something some guy made up.
Oh, wait, I didn't even, it was Michael Crichton too. He wrote,
I believe so. I might have that wrong, but I think it's Michael Crichton.
I just went to close that tab and his name is at the bottom of this thing. He wrote a bunch of sci-fi novels. He's a sci-fi author.
Yeah, like Jurassic Park, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is you said we defer fact checking. And I think it's interesting because I feel like it goes further, right? Because not just deferring fact checking, but sometimes we outright right around it. Like the Mandela effect is an example of that, where we're like, this is factually wrong. Okay, but, and we figure out a way to still be right. How do we combat that? Because that leads to a lot of harmful things. The Mandela effect's pretty harmless, but
no, so I was talking a bit earlier about the role that algorithms play in structuring social media. And I think we can think about how that structures then the individual user experience, right? You see certain things, but don't see other things. But one of the other insidious things is how it structures journalism, right? That if you are a journalist working for a publication that is for profit, which is most journalists, you make money from subscriptions and from people sharing your content, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're in this market that's not just other reputable papers, but also what I like to call online tabloids, those sort of rumor or gossip mongers who will do things like someone posts something on Reddit, and then they will write an entire article about that Reddit post as if it's fact, and then someone shares it on Reddit as if, hey, this thing's actually real. And again, there is no core here. It's this constant deferral. So the internet and the way specifically social media is algorithmically structured for engagement also puts a lot of pressure on journalists to report first and to report in ways that are a little bit sensational. That we don't quite know what the truth is here, but we're seeing this thing online, right? People are saying that Momo is everywhere on YouTube. We haven't actually gotten to check that ourselves, but people are saying it, and that's the news. And then when someone reads that or shares that, they assume that someone has done that kind of fact checking because there's this big impetus to get that story out as soon as you can, because the story that comes out first tends to be the one that gets shared most on social media. It tends to be the one that when you go to Google News or whatever your news app is, it's the one with the big headline, not the tiny other headlines.
Then when presented with information like, actually, that's not true, the instinct we have to say, well, actually, maybe we're in a different reality, or maybe this is a cover-up, or do you think that stems entirely from not wanting to be wrong or have held a wrong belief?
I think there are a couple ways you can look at it. I think the charitable version is that we kind of enjoy this sort of memory play. That it's fun, even though we know this probably isn't the case, to work with a group of people and kind of make up. But on the other hand, I think it's a symptom of a much larger social problem. And it tends to be kind of a frivolous one, right? It's not like sharing a conspiracy. It's not like, going deep into QAnon stuff. But on the other hand, it kind of is, right? That the way in which I think a lot of radicalization happens on the internet is by putting a foot in the door. That, oh, I watched this funny video that says that there's a made-up conspiracy that birds aren't real, or that there's a made-up conspiracy that Nelson Mandela died in the 80s but was trying to get us to think that he's still living, or that there's a made-up conspiracy to hide that we used to be two realities and now we're one. But then YouTube sees that you're interested in this kind of content. Well, hey, would you like some other fun conspiracy content? Hey, this one, which we're going to recommend, is mostly light and fun stuff, but then is also kind of bringing up some uncomfortable conspiracy stuff. Maybe it's talking about conspiracies around 5G and anti-vaccination, but it's doing so in sort of a funny way. Well, hey, you like that video? Well, what about this video about conspiracies? And what initially might seem like a rabbit hole very quickly reveals itself to be quicksand. That by giving us more and more and more of this stuff we want to see, by suggesting stuff, and this video was reasonable, why is this one unreasonable? Very quickly we can end up in some really uncomfortable places on the internet. Places that seem viable, almost trustworthy, where someone who looks like me is sitting in front of their computer and they're saying, you know what? I used to be skeptical too, but I did some research and let me share with you why I believe the earth is really flat. Because institutions who don't look like you and me, who are out of touch, they're trying to pull one over on us. And I think there's something that appeals about that idea of the little guy, the everyday guy, knowing more than the institution. And I think this is yet again another very quintessential part of American culture and the directions it's turned over the last 50 years or so.
It's interesting how all of these things not just dovetail, but like form a full-on Ouroboros of like influencing each other.
It is what we would call a system. And it's tough because another part of American culture is we're really big on individual solutions. You've talked about fake news before. The solution to fake news is, do you want to take a stab at what I'm going to say?
I think it's what Perry just typed into our little scratchpad notepad here.
Media literacy?
The solution to fake news is media literacy. And I don't want to totally dismiss this, right? That I do think it's a worthwhile idea to be teaching young people what good and bad information is. But this is also a very individualized solution, right? This is saying that it's not, to use a different, more heated argument, it's not that guns are a problem because they're a technology that allows you to kill a lot of people quickly from a distance. It's a mental health issue. It's a singular issue instead of a systemic issue. And I think there's something similar going on with fake news, that the only way that we're really talking about it is in terms of individual issues. We just need to give everyone more media literacy and they're going to get better at it. But if the informational diet that you're served is completely full of candy and sugar, does more information literacy really help? If we're in this environment where social media algorithms, one point of this pyramid, exert influence on individual users and on journalists, so journalists are really quick to report and write stories in certain ways and don't fact check and defer, and individuals trust their connections and trust what social media is sharing with them. We have these 3 points in this triangle that are all reinforcing each other in these deeply entrenched problematic patterns. And the problem is, we can fix any one of these 3 points. We can give social media better algorithms, but if journalists are in this environment where tabloids and rumor are still the thing that people are sharing, well, then we're not really fixing the problem. Similarly, we can increase digital literacy, but if the media that is being served to you is it doesn't actually solve the problem. And unless we work on all 3 of these things in concert, unless we think of this as a system, we're screwed. And there's really no way things are going to get better.
And I think that ties into the same reason people fall into moral panics, right? Because it's a lot easier to point the finger at a simple problem and claim that will fix it all.
We like simple chains of causality. This person did thing, they're either an aberration or there's some really simple fix here. And we don't have to think more deeply about things like maybe we need to address mental health. Maybe we fundamentally need to change what we value as a society. We are a culture who really likes individualized, easy solutions. And that's a problem because we don't take a lot of time to think more deeply and challenge ourselves about what might actually need to get done culturally in order to fix issues.
And then that's compounded too, just by the way that we live, because people don't have time or mental energy to be able to do that because we're all stressed and working too long and being fed all of these things, you know?
Everything is so quick. It's go, go, go. And this is a problem that journalists have been struggling with for over 100 years. There's a bit that I like to share with my social media class. It was written by John Dewey in like 1927, talking about how people are getting so much news from all over the world at this point from, broadsheet journalism that they're no longer able to really identify and focus on important local issues. And this velocity and this scope has just been widening and widening and widening.
Did you say 1920s?
1927. I think it's from The Public and Its Problems. I have my lecture notes in a different screen, so I can fact check down that one really quick.
That's amazing. That's like almost 100 years ago.
Yeah. Here's the specific quote from The Public and Its Problems from 1927. But the machine age has so enormously expanded, multiplied, intensified, and complicated the scope of the indirect consequences that the resultant public cannot distinguish itself. There are too many publics and too much public concern for our existing resources to cope with. So John Dewey is talking about the attention economy 100 years ago, right? This is a recurring problem in our system.
You were mentioning those three areas that require attention or that are creating this problem as they pull against each other. And each of those in some way is driven by an economic factor, whether that's financial or not. But you have attention economy, you have journalists with the need to fill a vacuum, you have people with the need to kind of continue to socialize, build connections. All of the economies are trying to centralize on the immediacy factor of that. How do we deal with this, especially when we're in a global pluralistic society where we can regulate maybe one area and put pressure on one area, but we can't really control everything?
If I had an answer to that, I would have such a higher paying job. You have no idea. No, so that's the problem, right? That's this race to the bottom. That even if we were to fix everything, say in the American context, we formalize instruction in digital literacy, we tamp down on tabloids and rumors, which fundamentally raises free speech issues, right? Because who's going to do that tamping down? Well, if it's the government or Congress, that's a First Amendment issue. But even if we somehow fix all of those things, well, the internet isn't just American, even though very often Americans assume it is. So what happens when you have apps that are coming out of other countries, right? That the breadth of this problem is becoming so huge that there's no easy solution here. And that sucks to say, because again, we want there to be an easy solution and there isn't one. And that's kind of frightening and it's kind of uncomfortable and it's kind of challenging.
Yeah.
So then the last thing, now that we've gotten to frightening, uncomfortable, and challenging, why don't we have you give some comments on the whole AI, machine learning, then also folk belief about AI and the impact of AI on folklore? So we hit it from every angle.
Okay, let's do those one at a time. So when it comes to artificial intelligence, that is not a name I would use. I would use something like machine learning. It's predictive, right? It looks at big bodies of texts and says, okay, statistically speaking, after these couple of words on this topic, this is the word that's most likely to show up next. It is effectively a calculator with glorified public relations that the people who do things like create and maintain ChatGPT, they're really invested in calling this artificial intelligence because it builds on these assumptions that we all have from having read sci-fi stories in our youth, or maybe more recently if you're still a fan. Ideas of like, oh, this is going to create Skynet and we're going to get hunted by Terminators. When actually the uncomfortable truth is what this is going to do is it's going to cost a lot of people who do public relations work their jobs because they're going to get replaced with a really shitty program that's making guesses and someone has to fact check them anyway, or maybe not. There's a lot of worry right now that we are heading towards some sort of dystopian future where computers are going to become sentient. And that's really not what's happening with machine learning. What is happening is, I think, a lot of people who are currently highly resourced in our social system, people with money, are going to see this as the next big thing, and they're going to use that as a way to replace actual people. This is the self-checkout of communications technologies. It's not necessarily better. It's not smarter. I have to do a lot of the work myself, but this is a way that we can try to pinch some pennies and seem like we're a little bit cool. So I am very skeptical about a lot of the long-term potential changes that people who make AI say that they're going to herald. And maybe I'll be wrong one day. And you know what? If I am, someone can play this podcast episode and I will say, you know what? It wasn't that I was living in reality B where AI was. It's actually that I was just wrong because I am a person I'm well read in a narrow body of literature, but I am wrong all the goddamn time.
I love that. And I wish that that was something that was more societally normalized to say.
Yeah. So that was question one of like three. What were the other two questions?
I think that those kind of wrapped it up. So I think when we're talking about AI and machine learning, there is the impact that it has on society. There is the folk belief about what AI and ML is actually doing today and can do. And then there's the potential impact long-term on folklore, academia, and the world at large.
It is, this is another noun that I'm going to miss. Pareidolia, I think is the word.
Oh, yeah. Like seeing faces and patterns, right?
Exactly. And that is what machine learning presented as intelligence is. It says more about the person looking at it and the meaning they derive from a semi-random chain of words than any actual thought process happening on the part of the computer. It is looking at a chain of random numbers and being like, oh my God, 12789, that's my birthday.
That's fun.
After the break, the conclusion of our interview with Dr. Andrew Peck.
Shout out to Claritin for supporting this episode and providing us with samples. Heya, Mason here, and I don't think I've mentioned it on the show before, but I have two cats, two big old boys named Chester and Cinders, and I love them both very much. But I didn't grow up with cats, and I've never suffered from general allergies like pollen, so it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that I was allergic to them. No joke, when I started working from home, I would say things like, wow, I feel like I'm losing my voice every day, or isn't it weird, I can't breathe through my nose for some reason. Ultimately, it was my partner who said, that really sounds like allergies, and long story short, now I take a Claritin every day. Luckily, for those of us who live with the symptoms of allergies, we can live Claritin Clear with Claritin D. Designed for serious allergy sufferers, Claritin D has 2 powerful ingredients in just one pill that relieve your allergy symptoms and decongest your nose so you can breathe better. Ready to live life as if you don't have allergies? It's time to live Claritin Clear. Fast and powerful relief is just a quick trip away. Ask for Claritin D at your local pharmacy counter. You don't even need a prescription. Go to Claritin.com right now for a discount so you can live Claritin Clear. Use as directed.
Welcome back.
I have one more thought, or one more thing I want to get your thoughts on regarding AI. I do not know enough to make any kind of educated statement about this, but I find it interesting that the training data that these machine learning programs were trained on is largely input from people online that are non-institutional, right? Like they scraped a lot of Reddit, they scrape a lot of Twitter to figure out how people talk. And like Lynn McNeil puts it as divining the syntax of the way we talk, which I think is cool. But I think it's interesting that that is in itself, it has been trained on our folkloric communication. It's us talking to each other and telling each other stories rather than training it on just like, I don't know, JSTOR or something on academic papers. So I wonder how that feels to you. I don't know exactly what point I'm trying to make. I just think it's something that's interesting. I don't have enough knowledge about it.
So I'd mentioned earlier in this interview, this sort of way in which that we're taught formal writing, but informal writing's not something we're taught. The internet really complicates that because so much of the internet is informal writing, and it's very public informal writing and shared informal writing. So what people have had to do over the last couple of decades are sort of collaboratively grasp at what those rules are for informal public writing on social media, especially, has brought this to a head. And so then if we're training AI on basically bodies of texts like that, if we're training them on our own sort of like folkloric grasped, I think these are the rules, then we enter this sort of weird sort of institutional vernacular hybridity with the AI. And with the way in which it communicates being this sort of weirdly hybridized formal, informal writing style. But I also might be putting too much intentionality there, that maybe it's more that we see it as informal and conversational rather than it's actually informal. One thing I wanted to bring up on the subject of AI, have you done the thing yet? This is the meme going around where you Google countries in Africa that start with K.
No, what?
Do it. Do it right now. Countries in Africa that start with K via Google Chrome. Or Google.
It's the second most suggested auto finish.
I told you it's going around.
While there are 54 recognized countries in Africa, none of them begin with the letter K. The closest is Kenya, which starts with a K sound, but is actually spelled with a K sound. It is always interesting to learn new trivia facts like that. What?
So remember earlier in the interview where I talked about how problematic algorithms are because they sort content for us, right? Because of search engine optimization, the top result for this that Google is giving you as a suggested result is an output from ChatGPT that someone put on a website that is gaming the system and showing up at the top of Google results.
Wow. This is fascinating. I don't know how this passed my radar.
So
That is weird.
when I talk about the importance of algorithmic curation, it's because when you say Google something, most people don't scroll down. They don't even really, they never go to the second page, but they rarely go past the first couple of results. And now if those results, because of how fine a game search engine optimization has become, if those results are just unfact-checked AI outputting that's what we get when we try to figure out what the truth is.
Oh my gosh. And the trust we place in things like Google.
Right? When you think about something like, say, digital literacy, a lot of kids nowadays are taught, and credit where credit's due, this comes from Dana Boyd's book, It's Complicated. A lot of kids nowadays are taught not to use Wikipedia when they're doing a research paper. Were you taught this, Mason? Don't cite Wikipedia in a research paper?
Yeah.
Why is that?
They always say because anybody can change it. You can't trust what's on there.
Anyone can change it. But what this elides is that Wikipedia does have standards for truth and citation. At the same time, kids are told if they don't know something nowadays, what should they do? How should they figure it out?
Google it.
You Google it. Perfect. And so what this leads to is young people thinking that stuff on Google is true because the adults in their life say, if you don't know it, Google it. And Wikipedia is not trustworthy because anyone can edit it, when actuality says that it's the reverse. Wikipedia is much more trustworthy than Google, which has no mechanism to control for truth. And so you end up with a lot of young people who end up coming to uninformed conclusions because they use this heuristic. Google is true, thing that shows up at the top, someone must have edited that, versus Wikipedia is fake.
And it's funny, too, because Google has a very obvious large profit motive, and Wikipedia is a nonprofit and has an army of nerds who just want to be right, constantly fact-checking everything.
Oh, yeah. And I've had that discussion with my kids because they still have teachers that say that about Wikipedia. And I say that is demonstrably wrong because you look at most encyclopedias and they're on a several-year cycle of refreshing their material versus Wikipedia, which is near real time. And a lot of people really being incented to try to do the right thing and to filter out falsehoods and to raise up truths. One fun thing that I did is I went to Bing and I did the same search and did not get the algorithmically enhanced falsehood brought up to the top. So if there's one argument for Bing, then there you go.
I've been using DuckDuckGo for privacy concerns for similar reasons. And a lot of this is, Google is the biggest game in town. So a lot of search engine optimization is written for either Google search or anything that uses Google search as a backbone. And what that has meant, and I'm sure anyone who's tried to Google not just this, but think of any recent video game. Hey, in Baldur's Gate 3, where do I find this specific item? And all the results you're going to get are, videogamemag.com with an AI-written story that's 1,000 words long and trying to hit as many keywords as possible that doesn't actually answer your question in any sort of serviceable way.
Those.
And you get an entire page of those now.
It's to the point that even me, I personally append the word Reddit to the end of every search when I'm looking for information because that's the only place that actual people are talking about stuff.
I do the same thing. Yep, 100%. The more people who use these platforms, and the more these platforms are kind of oriented toward not truth, but expediency, being simple, easy to use, just giving you an answer. You just need an answer. You're not going to fact check it. You're not going to. The more problems we run into.
And these sites just want to serve you ads, so they want articles that show up higher so that they can get their ad revenue. Yeah.
They're all trying to make money all the way down, and it's creating this terrible system.
And there is no simple solution.
Nope.
On that extremely uplifting note, we should make sure we hit your books, where people can find you, follow you, anything that you want to plug.
So the most damning thing I can say is I'm effectively not on social media anymore.
I'm jealous.
Yeah. I have a couple accounts I use just professionally for other folklorists to promote my work. I am off of almost every social network at this point, and I would highly recommend that to any of your listeners. Social media is terrible. It makes you feel worse. It is not an accurate picture of society, and it unfortunately forms the backbone of just about everything in our lives at this point. So sign off, delete your account. It's a good idea. Except for this.
Except for this.
Except for podcasts. Keep podcasts.
Yeah. If people are interested in the stuff I do, if you don't have an academic library account, I did just publish a book. It's called Digital Legend and Belief. And it uses the case of an urban legend called the Slender Man. Listen to the first episode of this podcast if you don't know what that is or want to know more. But it uses the case of how that came into being, how that got bigger, how that got co-opted first by YouTube celebrities and then ultimately by journalists as a way of understanding how belief in the age of the internet comes into being and circulates and gets bigger and ultimately can lead people to believe some really uncomfortable things.
Thanks so much for listening, and thank you to Dr. Andrew Peck for spending time with us. Check out our show notes for links to find out more about Andrew, as well as his books, research, and more. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for a future episode, you can reach us at hello@eighthlayermedia.com. If you'd like information about sponsoring an episode, a few episodes, or hey, an entire season, hit us up. We would love to hear from you. Digital Folklore is created and produced by Eighth Layer Media. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.
Nowadays, trends and news cycles change faster than we can blink. But there are some things that withstand the test of time. And if you're looking for a connection to something timeless, and maybe also a glimpse of life at a slower pace, I believe everyone can relate to the very human experiences explored in Jane Austen's novels. And that's where I come in. My name is Alison Larkin. I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin. I spent a lot of my childhood in the part of England where Jane Austen lived and wrote, and now that I live in the States, nothing gives me a sense of homecoming quite like narrating her books. On this show, you'll listen to award-winning narration. I'll give myself a pat on the back for that. As well as conversations with actors, writers, and other fascinating people who all share a passionate love for Jane Austen. So please, join me as we embark on a wonderful journey through Jane Austen's work. Be sure to listen and subscribe to the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin, wherever you get your podcasts.